Hello, so in this video I'm going to be explaining negative externalities, so I'll put that at the top. We're going to be looking at negative externalities in production and consumption, but the most important thing to remember is that negative externalities are caused by external costs, and that's the root of the problem. And it's an external cost because it's born, or the person that's suffering is going to be a third party. So by third party, I mean someone not involved in the decision making. So not the producer, not the consumer. They haven't had a say in whether this happens to them or not. The cost is just going to be imposed on them. So thinking about negative externalities in production, it's where there's an external cost imposed on a third party because of the creation of this product. So when I'm telling my classes about negative externalities in production, I get them to think about factories and the production process. So it could be a factory that's causing a lot of noise pollution or CO2 emissions or things like that, but it's in the production. So I'm going to do on this side negative externalities in production. I'm going to call it prod, and then this side it's going to be consumption. So I'm going to call it con. So remember to label your diagrams, because you don't get marks if you don't label your axes and label all the points on the diagram. So a really good tip as well when you're drawing diagrams, if you get into the exam and your mind goes blank, just do a cross in the middle of your diagram for demand and supply, and you do get some marks for just being able to label things. So we'll start with our diagrams first of all. Now, a negative externality in production looks like this. It has two supply curves, and a negative externality in consumption has two demand curves. So it can get really confusing, especially when you have to learn about positive externalities as well. But the really important thing is with negative externalities, essentially it's going to be market failure because we're going to have overproduction. So if you label your axes as well, we've got Q there. With overproduction, this is going to be Q1, I'm going to label it as, and Q1 is going to be the actual equilibrium, but Q2 is going to be the socially optimal equilibrium. So I'll just label these up and then I'll tell you what I mean by that in a sec. So in these diagrams, because they're negative externalities, Q2 is always going to be on the inside of Q1. Now, for those of you who maybe took this exam last year and you're just doing some research stuff, you might have labelled them slightly differently last year. So you might have labelled them, just get that one on, you might have labelled this supply curve here, which I'm going to put as S2, as the marginal social cost, there we go, and S1 as the marginal private cost. Okay, if you're doing the exam with AQA this year, they said that you don't need to know these labels. On this side, if it was, you probably didn't learn it if you did it last year, but a negative externality in consumption, this demand, which is D1, you may have labelled it as marginal private benefit, and then the one that's further inwards as marginal, oh, that's a funny M, but social benefit. I'm running out of space here, sorry. But again, if you're doing the reformed A level, so you're doing kind of the AS level this year and year 2 next year to make up the A level, when you do 3 exams next year, you don't need to put these labels on. The board have said that you don't. Okay, so what's happening in this diagram, and I'm going to change colour. What's happening in this diagram, the production one, is that if the producer was taking into account the full costs of the activity, so if they did recognise the external cost, they would produce at Q2, their supply curve would be S2, but it's a negative externality, meaning that it's an external cost to a third party, so the producer doesn't take that cost into account, so their costs are lower actually than they should be, so they're producing at S1, and therefore when there's more supply in the market, it means that the price is reduced, and we know that a lower price causes a movement along the demand curve, and we get Q1 out here. So Q1, P1 representing the actual equilibrium, but we really, if we were taking all the costs into account, we'd be there, the point that I've just circled. Now, if you want to represent the welfare loss, and this is a tip for any of these externality diagrams that you do, even for the positive ones, if you go from your actual equilibrium, and then you either have to go upwards or downwards, but you look where the other curve is, and in this case it's upwards. Go upwards till you meet that. Now that dotted line there, or I'm going to make it a straight line, that represents the value of the external cost. And if you shade in that triangle there, that is the welfare loss, or sometimes called the deadweight loss. Okay, so that triangle there represents the loss to society, and it shows the overproduction in the market. So we should be at P2, Q2, but because the producer's not taking into account the full cost of their activity, they are actually at P1, Q1. So we've got, as you can see here, we've got overproduction in the market. The same thing's going to happen over on this side with the consumer, negative externalities in consumption. Now this is a really good example of this would be smoking and passive smoke. So passive smoke onto third parties, people that haven't made the decision to smoke or not, and they are affected negatively by smoke from cigarettes as well. So it's the same story, but people, in this case, they're over consuming the product. So the actual equilibrium is here, but if consumers could feel the full cost of their activities, they wouldn't be demanding this much. The demand would be much further in, it'd be D2 there. So demand would have shifted inwards if they could feel the full cost of their activities. Therefore, the price would be a lot lower because there's less demand in the market. And when demand shifts, we get a movement along the supply curve. So we'd actually be at this equilibrium here, and we'd see that the quantity would be much lower than it actually is at Q1. But the consumer doesn't take into account the full cost of their activity. So what we do to show the external cost, we find the actual equilibrium, and then, as I said before, we either have to go up or down to meet the other curve. So in this case it's going down, and that line there, that represents the value of the external cost, and again we've got a triangle, and that represents the loss to society through this overproduction. We can see there we should be at Q2, but we're actually at Q1.